Good evening.
Good evening.
We've got a speaker's corner.
Hey.
Kathryn Jacobs published 6 books in the 32 years she taught classes. And her latest book, was co-written with her daughter Rebecca, and it is A Life Lived Differently. And Rebecca will be on board in about 8 days?
8 days. It's Rachel, by the way.
What did I say, Rebecca?
Rachel.
No,
Yeah. It's another similar sounding name.
you're in our name. So, all right. So with that, I'm going to bring Kathryn on, and we'll get to hear more about her life and poetry.
All right.
Hello. Thank you.
Yes. What? Can you hear me?
No. Now you can hear me. Yes, very good. Okay. I called this A Life Lived Differently because that's the name of the last book that I co-wrote with Rachel. I became, to give some little background, I became interested in writing poetry from an autistic point of view because autism runs in my family. Different generations, different people, and it wasn't till I was helping out with some of the people who needed assistance in my family that I realized that I was probably on the spectrum myself. And in fact, some of the other people that have managed, pretty well in my family also. We just have there's a I don't want to get into a lot of autism. Autism has a whole panoply of. It's not one thing. It's you identify it by symptoms, by behavior, by patterns, and people are different. Different autistic people are different. All right, just like everybody else is. But there are things that tend to reoccur, and some of them you'll see in my poetry. And there's a lot of us who function pretty well, but I see the same things in us that I see in some of the others. So basically, both my daughter and I started getting involved. My daughter is, by the way, totally neuronormal, and thank God, because we need somebody who is. But we started getting involved in what I think of as translation, trying to be the middle ground between people who need someone to speak for them and the people who need to be communicating better. So we started doing a lot of that, and that got me thinking about it. And I created this boy called Dan, all right? And he all the poetry I'm going to give you today is from Dan's point of view, all right? So I'm going to tackle, before I start reading the poetry, I'm going to tackle a few of the obvious questions that might come up. First of all, is Dan real? Well, he is an amalgam. He is a mixture of me and some other people in my family, some of the problems that have come up, some of the situations that have come up, as filtered through me. And so he's not really just me, and he's not really anybody else that I know, but he has several of us in him. I'm not going to talk, don't worry, about Chaucer today, but there's this character called the Wife of Bath, who Chaucer created, and the Wife of Bath started off just being one pilgrim, and then she sort of took over. I mean, she keeps interrupting other people's pilgrims, other people's stories. She gets referred to, she makes comments in the margin after the stories. She becomes by far the biggest character in the Canterbury Tales. And Dan has sort of been like that for me. Once I created him, I would go through life and I'll know exactly what Dan would think or say in any particular situation. And it's not particularly what I would necessarily think or say, but it's just that I get to know him really well, all right? So I've been writing Dan poems. I pretty much covered the first one. Point B is point of view, and this is where I got into some problems. If I'm going to write for Dan, it has to be from his point of view, all right? There can't be compromise on that, okay? But Dan might talk to you, and some of you would understand, and some of you might not, and you might have questions, and Dan couldn't tell you, well, really, for the neuronormal people of the world, this is what you would think and this is what's really going on. Dan can't translate, all right? So that's the job. Somebody else basically has to help there, all right? Basically, fundamentally, that's the poet's job, and I do try, all right? But it can get particularly tricky because the more honest I am to his point of view, the harder it can be for other people to always understand it from their point of view. So that's the reason I co-wrote this one with my daughter. And I asked her in this book if she would write the mom, all right? Now she doesn't do it as poetry. She writes mom as prose. And the way we ended up publishing the book, the left side of the page is Dan, who always speaks in poetry, all right, because I'm a poet and that's what I do, all right? And then on the other side, the facing page, Rachel would write the mom, and the mom would give things from her point of view, all right, which is often quite different from Dan's, and that would help readers sometimes pick up what's going on. Now, you are unfortunate people in that you're not going to have mom here, you're just going to have me, but I do put a few I comment in the margin occasionally, so I can help out that way if I need to. Okay, so anyway, that's how Mom got involved. And at the beginning, she was writing pieces to my poems that I'd already written. But by the end, she kept giving me all these ideas for Dan. And of course, we'd pick it up from other people in the family. And then I'd write to her. So it ended up being, pretty much of a balance there. Okay, so B, C, in these poems, I will sometimes try to put non-verbal things into words, okay? Now, that requires compromise, all right? In total realism, I couldn't put all this in words at all. It would have to be in emotions or color or something else completely different. But this is a verbal media, so there are times when Dan will say things. It's true to his point of view, or as true as I can make it to his point of view, always. All right, but sometimes I have to be, again, the poet who stands in a little bit. So there's where I do compromise and where I don't compromise. And then the last thing I wanted to say for this page is that autism involves the whole family. All right, you have the people you have the people that you're trying to help, and you'll have their parents, and people care, and you'll have their teachers, and you'll have siblings. You'll find out from the poems I'm going to give you, Dan is very involved with his mother and his little brother Joshua, who's a neuronormal boy who tries to help out, but with sometimes mixed results. Dan also has a father, and you'll hear a little bit about that in the prologue I'm going to read to you, so I'll stop there. But it's not one individual. Autism never is. It's the entire team, basically, that's going to be involved. Okay, before I'm going to, I'll go real quickly over this because I know nobody in the whole world cares but me. All right, Dan poems, but I care, so I just have to tell you, Dan poems are written in pentameter. There are 10 syllables in every line. Mostly iambic, although like all poets, there are some lines that I can deliberately vary. Iambic means pa 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 pa. It's the basic pattern. It's a basic pattern of English speech. Some are blank verse, which means unrhymed. Some are rhymed, and a lot of those, but not all of those, are sonnets. So that's sort of the format of it. And then I want to just mention the diction. The first poems that I'm reading are Dan at his youngest. And then as I go on, there are not too many, don't worry. I'm not reading too many. But as I go on, he gets older, and that affects things like his diction. Okay. So then I want to give you two other little prose bits, and then I'll stop and ask if there's anything I said that was just plain confusing, if anybody has questions so far, and then I'll do the poetry. All right, this is the part of basically the prologue that I wrote to the book. Mom has her prologue, but you're not going to get Mom's prologue. In many ways, a life lived differently is about disconnect. Dan has an active mental life, but finds himself out of sync with the world he does his damnedest to make sense of. In this, he is aided by his mom, who tries hard to find a workable compromise, and believe me, it ain't easy. Then there is the disconnect between Dan's father and her because special needs can strain a marriage. Finally, there is Joshua, the neurotypical younger brother, who does his best to be helpful with mixed results. In short, A Life Lived Differently is about well-meaning people who actually like each other, and it's still a struggle. All right. Now this is the professor voice in me explaining these things. But at this point, Dan interrupts. All right. That's just not the way Dan would think of things. All right. So Dan just read this and is protesting. Let me be clear then. Dan is not the least confused. It's the world that is inconsistent. About pronouns, for instance. He wants all of you to understand that I and you cannot possibly be trusted because they jump around so much. That's why Dan sticks firmly to the third person. Dan doesn't change. It's also why he has so much trouble with that trick question, how are you? You all say it, but only certain answers are allowed, and he doesn't always know which ones. There, Dan approves now. Okay, that's Dan interrupting, and you'll see, I should have go back and forth that way a little bit now and then. All right, before I actually start reading any poetry, anybody want to ask any quick questions? Yeah.
About how old is Rachel when she was writing this with you?
With me, she's an adult woman.
Okay.
Yeah, no, she's not a kid. I love children. I'm very involved with children, but it's complicated to write things like poetry or poetry. My daughter is not only an adult woman, but she is an editor and a writer professionally. So she's actually pretty good at writing. She just writes prose.
So this is a fairly recent book?
Yeah, it was only 23 it came out, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions? Third person is, in case, I, he, you, he. It's the he, she line. All right. He doesn't like I and you because he says they jump around so much. If mother is telling you something and she says I, and then you say I, then they'll say, no, you mean you. All right? I mean, people keep changing the pronouns on you, and it seems very unfair. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, can you define what a sonnet is for those?
Oh, yes, I can. Sonnets are 14 lines. They are 10 syllables per line. I mean, you might get an 11th stuck in there if it's not accented, but in general, there's a 10-syllable line, and they rhyme. That's the traditional sonnet. Modern people have greatly broadened its definition, so things can be called sonnets sometimes that would never fit the earlier definitions, but that's basically what a sonnet is. It's a good question. Anything else? All right. Dan Solo. That's the title, but I'm calling this people practice as well because you can hear what he's working on. How are you? Great. Dan says he's great. Or not. You can't say no. That's not an answer. But a not so great is fine. Or you can say fine, too. So many choices. That's polite. You can't be wrong. Just pick one. Satisfied. The voice behind the bookcase tries again. Good boy, Dan. Thank you. Please and thank you. These make everybody happy. Love you, Dan. What Mom says when she hugs you. Just one hug. The bookcase seems to tremble. Love you, Mom. No hugs, though. Dan prefers to run away. She wants one. Poor Mom. One quick hug. Okay. You don't have to, don't applaud in between the parts. You can just wait till the end. This is just a continuing thing. All right. This one, there's no excuse for forks. This one, it's a little bit, particularly near the end, a little bit involving his autism, but it's also just about Dan being a child, because just because you're an autistic child does not mean you're not also a child. All right. So I try to remind people of that. There's no excuse for forks. Dan uses forks now. He prefers a spoon because a scoop is easier, but forks are just expected, so he had to learn to stab his macaroni. He's concerned about the ice cream, though, where stabs don't work, although it's fun to try, and pretty soon there isn't any, which distresses him. He shouldn't have to stab bananas, though, or strawberries. That is outrageous. That's one of Dan's special words, by the way, outrageous. But today she had a lot of leftovers and cut them up to make it hard for him. So Dan demanded grilled cheese sandwiches. He asked politely, please and thank you. But she just refused. No finger food today. All right? That's Dan's perspective on lunch. All right, and then there is take your seat. That's something that Dan's mother used to say until she realized he wasn't understanding very much. Wait a second. By the way, the spelling is deliberate here. I am aware that's not how you're supposed to spell the word. Take your seat and see where that got him. A meteorite killed the dinosaurs. Dan has just discovered this fact. A meteorite killed the dinosaurs. But Dan refuses to believe that, since two meteor wrongs never make a right. And Dan is missing out on dinosaurs because that one couldn't aim. So Dan was cross already. No one thinks of what they say like Dan does. They're just memorizing. And he had a conversation with himself because he likes the way Dan listens. When there was an interruption about chairs. Between the rude, erratic meteors and the upsetting lack of dinosaurs, Dan didn't have a lot of space for chairs. He scurried over, though, obediently. He even asked her, being logical, if he should sit instead of standing there, though she forgot to say so, which was when she rudely called Dan smartass. I don't know how many of you have had this experience with kids. It's not only autistic people, but we speak all these words and we know what they mean, so we don't think of them literally. We don't think about what you're actually saying, all right? I can tell you, even though I'm old now, that I always think first and foremost of the literal meaning of what people say. And then, because I'm used to people, I translate in my head. All right, it takes me a moment now and then, even now. It's the literal meaning I always hear first, and it sort of delights me. But anyway, that's partly what this is about, and the confusions of take your seat. Well, he did. He took his seat, you know. But she didn't tell him to sit down, so he didn't. All right, and of course, language has social interpretation. People don't think about what they say. Okay. I'm busy being Dan, Mom. There are ducks parading in Dan's head. So Joshua can be a line of ducklings. Joshua is smaller, so he has to let Dan pick, but Dan lets him pretend. And here's the fort for ducks that Dan made. Josh says, "Can I see?" "Good asking, Josh," Dan said supportively, because big brothers say that, but he's short, so no, he couldn't. And when he climbed out, Dan said Josh was a duck, and ducks stay put. "Mom, there are cheetahs out there. This can't be about what ducks want, not in cat country. Josh makes a good duck. He goes everywhere. But ducks aren't good at holding an idea." And I just can't tell you how many of these games and imaginations and things I have heard in my family in the different generations. The world is a scary place, and Dan is beginning to be aware of that. Okay, Legos. These are about Legos. If only the head stayed on. Dan's Lego people need a hospital because he drops them and their heads fall off. Or else they're sitting on their vehicles and hit a bump, and then they're down to stumps in bright red pants, a stubborn bottom half perched resolute, as always. Joshua says that hospitals can put the heads back on, but first you have to find them, and Dan tries, but Joshua gets bored and wanders. If the pegs fit better, or we found the girl before the radiator melted her, we wouldn't be so short of people. We have legs left and a pair of overalls, but somebody should teach them how to fall. And I have a little back and forth here at the bottom. The professor side of me would say social disconnect, isolation, the family getting smaller. If you had the whole series of poems, which I'd be very glad that you don't, but if you had them, you would, find the marriage breaking up and father leaving and stuff, family getting smaller. And then Dan, again, thinks I explain too much. All right, he just doesn't, whatever.
He's right.
He's right. He's definitely right. No question. Okay, anyway, Dan at some point goes with his family to a vacation in Arizona, where he does not normally live, and Dan strongly approves of Arizona. So this poem is strongly approves of Arizona, or plants bite but people chomp. Dan wants to be a tiny cat-sized deer and hide among the cacti. Joshua says he's going home because plants bite you here. But Dan would never pet a cholla, and at least the prickles warn you. Honestly, Dan isn't sure he feels safe anywhere, but he prefers to see the prickles here than be surprised at home. A tiny deer could lick up leaves as small as pea pod stems, or crunch the brittle bush like popcorn. And when stabby human beings did appear, they'd be too worried about cactus trees to notice Dan. So yes, he likes it here. And while the fuzzy cholla did bite Josh, at least it wasn't sneaky. One has to sort of, part of me is always feeling sorry for Josh after I finish these poems, you know. All right. Gray as Pencils, or the Autistic Monotone. Gray as Pencils is the actual title of the poem. This one is about it's a communication problem, I guess. It doesn't affect everybody, but it's not rare. That's doctors could tell you. And it certainly has affected some people in our family where they speak, instead of speaking the way you or I would normally speak, the voice is flat, basically. And it's harder for people to listen. So this is Dan's explanation of the problem, as you can tell he's getting older here. Dan's head is full of colored answers, but the questions only come in black and white. So when Dan tries to squeeze the meaning out, his voice goes gray as pencils. In his head, his voice goes up and down like music, but a secret monster sucks the color out till nothing's left but bones, and they get stuck. Dan has to take a breath and shove them out to talk at all. And Dan can hear himself. Words flat and colorless with gaps inside because Dan has to stop and concentrate. If he could tell you with his inside voice and you could see his bouncing colors, then we'd talk about 100 things at once exactly as they happen and not fuss if they could only hear his inside voice. And I think, did someone say something I should hear? Nope.
That's just the point in. That was
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you.
Yes.
I have one more here, so I obviously could have put a few more poems in. I wasn't sure how long all this would take. But this poem is where I chose to stop today, and it's self-advocacy starts young. Okay, self-advocacy is very, very important, all right, both for autists and others. Dan's brain is noisy. It's obstreperous. He's just learned that word, as you can tell, which is a bumpy word and hard to say. But Dan likes words that feel like packages, especially when Josh doesn't. Lots of words are sneaky like that, words that grown-ups use in front of Dan so he won't understand. But he remembers and asks questions. Dan suspected they were talking about him. Suspected is another sneaky word. Because he caught them looking, and he knows they didn't mean it nicely. But the Dan's big noisy brain will learn their secret words and bounce them back again. So starting now, he's saying yes, he is obstreperous, and he'll be louder later. All right, so sorry I'm short. All right, great. So comments, questions? I'm sure there must be things that you guys experiences or things you want to say or ask or bring up. Yeah.
Would you like to comment on JFK Jr. saying that autistic people will never write poetry?
I do not wish to comment on that.
Okay.
I believe that speakers should be polite. All right? I am determined to be polite, so we will not go there. But maybe that says enough?
Yep.
Okay, very good. He asked if I wanted to comment on RFK saying that autistic people would never write poetry. And I said, no, I don't think I better comment on that one.
That's preposterous.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? Yeah. Somebody back here? Yeah. Yes.
Is your book available?
It actually is about to be available. When I first came here, I didn't know how much room I'd have in my cabin. So I brought like nothing physical. I mean, I bought the absolute necessities. But then I was giving this lecture, and sorry, I don't mean to move. And I asked Rachel, who's coming to visit, if she could bring some of our book copies. And I was thinking I could even put one in the library, because then everybody could look at it if they wanted. Anybody who wanted to could look at it. And we'll have her bring a few more copies so that I can have them available if somebody wants that. So it's not at this very moment, but it will be about 8 days from now. All right. Kip, yeah.
Where does ADHD fit into the autism spectrum? And repeat the question.
That's a question you want to ask a professional.
And repeat the question.
Oh yeah. She wanted to know where ADHD fits in with on the autism spectrum, and that, remember, my experience, Kit, is personal and intimate and over many years. Okay, but it is not like I have studied autism, although somebody actually, or ADHD for that matter, although I've taught people with ADHD, so I know something about that too. How they fit together, though, I could not tell you, but does anybody else know? Somebody else might be able to address that.
I think they're different spectrums myself, but
That is how they're often talked about, at least.
And they're certainly treated very differently. They use different set of drugs, they have different presentations, and trying to jam things under one heading is probably counterproductive.
Did you all hear him? Do I have to repeat? You want me to?
Repeat.
Okay. Frank is opining that because they are treated very differently in all kinds of ways, including even medications, that they are not the same thing at all, that they are separate problems, or separate, I don't want to say problem. Problem is a word I object to. It seems to me that there are a lot of special conditions, I'll just say. There are a lot of things that are absolutely a positive, a good and useful thing in modest doses, all right? People like me don't generally get diagnosed because I manage, okay, in the world without getting diagnosed, all right? So it's when you have too much of something, you know? If it's an extreme, then it becomes a problem in dealing with the world, all right? But if you look at professors, in fact, I was reading an article, and it said that autism runs up to 4 times higher in the families of professors. And if you look at professors, an awful lot of us are probably on the spectrum, all right? And it's a positive. I mean, we're better at focusing, you know, we're better at blocking out distractions. We're not as involved as people, and that if you're doing research, that can be an advantage as well. But if you have too much of it, it can become a problem. So I suspect it's, that's something like that is the case. So I don't like the idea of looking at it always as a problem. I think that being on the spectrum can be a good thing. It's just you want to be able to talk to people. Yeah.
I think people need to understand it. Like, it's called a spectrum because it's like a rainbow. You know, we range from red right the way through to the deepest of purples. And a child on the spectrum may display a lot of red and a lot of green, and then someone else may display a lot of green and a lot of yellow. They don't compartmentalize it anymore. It's called a spectrum because we're all made up of the different colors. It's just that.
Let me just repeat, because your voice is not loud, but she is noting, I think correctly, that as you'd expect with the metaphor of the word spectrum, that individual people can be in very different places, show different colors, if you'll take that metaphor. And in fact, if you look at the most common things you see in autism, the one that I show most strongly is what they call stimming, what does it stand for? Someone help me out with this?
Stimulation.
Yeah, it's self-stimulation. Basically, as a little kid, from a tiny little kid, I would jump up and down, and I would wave my hands insanely in the air, all right? And my mother spent I do not know how many years trying to get me to sit down and be still and be a good, young lady. And now this is why I go to aquasize. And I go to aquasize and I can jump up and down and nobody tells me to stop. All right? It makes me so happy, honestly. It's like all the things that people have spent my whole childhood telling me not to do. Okay, I can do now. And for that matter, when I was teaching, all right, you just have to find your niche. When I was teaching, I would sometimes, if I'm reading poetry, I would sometimes, or like particularly a play, I would jump back and forth to take the different roles of whoever was talking. And the students would always say, oh, she's so high energy, she's so exciting, she makes it interesting, all right? But if I was doing something else, they would say, she can't sit down, she's not decorous. You just have to find a job that takes advantage of what you are, Yeah. Yes.
Can you just comment on the term neurodivergent? Is that an umbrella term that covers autism and other things?
That is certainly a word that has been used of both. It's basically neurodiverse. She asked me if I could comment on neurodiverse. I'm not going to say very much about that because, again, as I keep telling you, I have studied this from the experiential point of view, but I'm not a doctor. I'm not somebody who's written papers on it or something, okay? And that's a different point of view. But yes, neurodiverse is basically opposed to whatever is considered neuronormal. All right, normal is a very dangerous word, and I would never define it, and I'm not convinced very many people are normal. But, the further I get, the less I believe in normal. But anyway, that's the term neurodiverse has basically came into being to suggest that it's not just you're supposed to be this one thing, all right? There's a whole variety of ways of perceiving the world and having your brain works differently. Different people's brain works differently, and the diversity is trying to acknowledge that. And it's a helpful term, sometimes at least, because it acknowledges that not all diversity is a problem. That creativity can come out of different ways of looking at things. So that's really the only thing I can say about it. But if somebody else wants to add to that, I will repeat them loudly.
I think that was good.
That was good? All right. So no more comments or questions? Yeah, yes.
I'm going to
Keep moving, sorry. It really is hard to keep me sitting still.
Don't worry about it. When I was coaching people with ADHD, one of the points I made to them repeatedly was that ADHD is a gift. Some of the most successful, and I think this is probably true of autism, when people with autism are taught that it's a gift, so that they can appreciate their differences.
Absolutely.
Some of our most successful people through the ages, we can't really go back and check on Beethoven or people who've been dead.
We can only second guess.
That's right. But we anticipate from what we've heard and seen that a lot of artists especially, but scientists, had ADHD. Richard Branson, one of the most successful businessmen in the world, has ADHD. Bill Gates has ADHD. I don't know, haven't studied autism. I'll bet you can find the same thing if you dig back through.
I personally know a number of people who have been diagnosed with autism, who are what people call high functioning autism, and they spend enormous amounts of time analyzing social phenomena. What do people, when they say this, what do they really say? All right, analyzing facial expressions, all right? Smiles, for instance, I have so many different meanings in a smile. Just trying to interpret what people's faces are. What are they trying to communicate, all right? And they, they often come off as socially awkward, but they do just fine, and they have friends, and, I find some of them very interesting people. So that I can absolutely tell you. So it makes sense to me, what you're saying. Yeah?
In a nutshell, what is the basic difference between ADHD and autism?
Okay. Keep asking me hard questions. All right. ADHD, from a teacher's point of view, you have students whose attention skips, basically. They don't focus in on one argument or one whatever you're doing long enough to, if you're asking them to focus on one thing, all right, then it can be a problem from a teacher's point of view, all right? It's not always a problem, but it just depends on what you're doing, all right? That's like I say, from a teacher's point of view, and I'll happily get someone else to add to that in a minute if they want to. Autism is a whole variety of, autism is defined so far not by cells or biology or anything. It's I mean, although there's no question that the autistic brains work differently, but autism is defined by symptoms. I put that word in quotation marks, that's what I'm trying to do here, because it doesn't really get defined at all except when it's seen as a problem, which to me is a bias. I mean, it just means that we're only looking at the people who need some more assistance. We're not looking at everybody else. But, so it's a whole series of phenomena, and generally, if they define somebody, they look at how many of the common behavioral signs, how many of them this person has, and if they have a certain number of them, they'll say this person is autistic. But it's not like a hard and fast rule.
Well,
So I don't know if I've answered that question or not. Go on if you want to. Yes.
A lot
Yeah,
of people
yeah.
with ADHD, though, they can concentrate on things that they're interested in.
I do not doubt it in the slightest. Like it's like the one thing that it reminds the one thing, if you will, they both have in common is that it's really only talked about when it's a problem, and it's a problem in some particular situation. But I mean, if you put me on sports, I can tell you back when I was from a young kid on, I am extremely klutzy. I'm very uncoordinated. All right, every time I had to go to gym class, Gail Hargrove had to cover for me in volleyball. All right, and she just says, don't even try, you just get in my way, I'll cover for you, okay? I don't play pickleball, I wouldn't get better, okay? I just wouldn't get better, all right? It's if I were when I'm in a sports team, it would be a big problem, all right? It's not a problem otherwhere because as soon as I was allowed to skip gym, I skipped gym, all right? You know, not everything is, you know, most of us are better, have certain talents. You know, we're better at some things than others. And to my point of view, the key is to match the person with that niche in life, you know? And if you can do that, then that's great. Sometimes it's harder, but.
Well, and ADHD doesn't always mean, the H stands for hyperactive.
Right.
And I've decided that it could be your body that's hyperactive or your brain. And the brain is one that's is like popcorn, all over the place, jumping from point to point. Hyperactive body. One of my classmates in 5th or 6th grade, his nickname was Spinner because he couldn't sit still.
And they call that ADHD. Well, self-stimming does have some overlap in that one anyway. Yeah. The body keeps moving. Yeah. Other people? All right. Well, short and sweet. I enjoyed it. Hope you guys did.
Yeah.
Next time I'm going to have more fun.